Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, Aaron Muir. Our guest today is Dr. Chad Hanson of the John Muir Institute. And what's really important that we're having this conversation that we kind of like we're going to have in the fall around climate change, and the climate crisis around COP28 had to be moved forward. We're in the middle of the climate emergency. It has already begun. If you've been anywhere in the country, whether it's Texas, you've been witnessing weather over 40, 45 degrees Celsius, and in some cases 110 to 125 degrees Fahrenheit. We've been hit with everything from atmospheric rivers or oceans where the rain is coming down 7 inches or more within a couple of hours, flooding and inundating areas with 1,000-year floods, dry spells, dry patches in the Midwest if you're a farmer. But in the Northeast, the Goldilocks zone from Maine all the way down to Washington, D.C., the climate crisis has manifested itself in the form of smoke coming in from the forest fires in Canada, all the way down to atmospheric river storms that have disrupted and flooded communities from Maine all the way down to Washington, D.C. So it's important that we have this conversation now. So to that end, we want to get a climate expert, but also an ecological expert who really delves deeply into complex ecosystems and who's really what I call literally at the ground zero of solutions, which is forest, wilderness, and that is Dr. Chad Hanson. Chad, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Chad, could you tell us a little bit about the John Muir Society and the work that you folks do?
Yeah. So, what we do at John Muir Project is forest protection and forest ecology research, and we focus on two things: biodiversity and protection and conservation of biodiversity, and then also protection of forests from logging, is so they can absorb and store more carbon, draw down more carbon from the atmosphere to mitigate the climate crisis.
Behind me is the Adirondack. In the Adirondack is the largest deciduous forest in the lower 48 states, intact deciduous forest. We call it the lungs of America. And the reason why we call that, as in the carbon life cycle, trees are the most efficient resource, natural resource, and plants. The flora in our, whether it's in the ocean and seaweeds or forests, are the most complex but sophisticated but basic entities that sequester carbon. Talk a little bit about the process by which trees do that and why it's important to protect large impact ecosystems like the Pacific Northwest, the forest, all the way up to the Maine forest or the Adirondacks.
Yeah, this is the central question. This is what we need, policymakers to be focusing on, asking this question. We know we have a climate crisis and it's getting worse. And that's happening because there's a massive excess of CO2, of greenhouse gases, particularly CO2 in our atmosphere because of human activities. Two things: fossil fuel burning and also logging. And people don't realize logging is a huge factor in terms of annual carbon emissions. But in order to get out of the climate crisis, in order to mitigate it and get back to a healthier planet and healthier climate, we have to do not one, but two things. We have to get away from fossil fuels. I think, there's a broad recognition of that. But what a lot of people don't realize, including a lot of, policy experts, they don't realize that is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's not nearly enough. We also have to protect vast areas of ecosystems, especially forests, so that they can draw down more of the dangerous excess CO2 in our atmosphere and store it in the living, growing plants. And in forests, of course, that's mostly trees. And your biggest bang for your buck in terms of climate change mitigation is forests.
And again, you and I use very powerful big words: mitigation. Tell us what mitigation means.
Yeah, so in the most basic terms, right now we're well over 420 parts per million of CO2 equivalents in our atmosphere. And what the climate science is telling us is that we need to be we need to be at 350 or below, preferably well below 350. So we're way above the healthy levels. And it's causing all kinds of extreme disruptions. And we're seeing that right now, that affecting not just ecosystems, but human communities all over the country, all over the planet. So what a lot of people don't realize is that when we put all that excess CO2 up in the atmosphere, it stays up there for a very, very, very long time. It takes a very long time for it to just naturally passively come down. It stays up there for centuries, even thousands of years.
Right.
So if all we do is get away from fossil fuels, those excess CO2 levels that are causing so much disruption and chaos are going to stay that way for a very long time. And we would not avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis, but we would prevent it from getting even worse. In order to mitigate it effectively and bring it down below 350, we need to protect ecosystems, because that's our really only effective and positive, ecologically positive way to bring those dangerous CO2 levels down. And it turns out the good news is there's lots of science telling us that we can actually do that. We can do that if we actually change our policies and protect a lot more forests so they're not being logged, because logging is a double whammy. It puts a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, and it undermines and compromises the ability of forests to act as carbon sinks.
And when we talk about ecosystems, and this is basically the entire place and space where trees exist. And so there's trees within a forest. Within the forest, the trees are rooted in a soil, so there has to be healthy soils, clean water for them to grow. But also, there's something which they call scientifically flora, and there's something called fauna. And there's been also biodiversity comps and biodiversity conversations. Talk us, what is biodiversity and how is that important with regards to the life cycle and healthy life cycle of trees and forests and the general system that we need to build by preserving a healthy forest to sequester carbon? Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, thanks. That's a key question. So, carbon-rich forests tend to be biodiverse forests, and when you talk about the carbon richness in forests, you're talking not just about the live trees or just the big trees. You're also talking about dead trees. What people call snags or stags. You're talking about down logs and all the decaying material on the forest floor. An ecologically healthy and biodiverse forest is messy. You've got different ages in the forest. You've got areas that burned, and you've got patches of dead trees, sometimes large patches. All kinds of species have evolved to depend on those dead trees, just like there's all kinds of different other species that have evolved to depend on the patches that are mostly live green trees. So you need that mix. It's actually really healthy. And when forests burn, the vast majority of the carbon stays in the forest, and it actually cycles nutrients, and it actually helps the forest draw down that excess CO2. So, it's all good in the forest when you're talking about natural processes, despite the fact there's a lot of fear and misunderstanding about these processes. What's not good is when we're pulling carbon out of the forest through industrial processes like logging, because the fact is that, again, not only does that undermine the carbon sink capacity of the forest, because there's fewer trees to draw down carbon, but it also puts a huge amount of carbon into the atmosphere, because when trees are removed, only a small percentage of that ends up in a lumber product somewhere. Most of the carbon in a tree that's removed from a forest through logging ends up in the atmosphere almost immediately.
Right. But the other piece of that is you're also interfering with an ecosystem. You're interfering with a life cycle. Okay. Trees grow young, old, fall over, decay, or burn, but they stay within the ecosystem. You take something out, that's a factor that actually alters that ecosystem. Am I correct?
It's absolutely right. People oftentimes don't think about how critically important trees are, not just when they're alive, but also after they die. In many ways, in a forest ecosystem, a tree fully realizes its ecological potential after it dies, in terms of its being habitat for wildlife, and then for cavity nesters, for example. And then when it falls, it decays into soil, and all those amazing nutrients that are in the bark and the branches and the needles, those decay into soil, and they replenish the soil, and they basically spur the growth of the next generation of trees. And when you remove them from the forest, you undermine that.
And that's the point. People tend to think that they think about fertilizing the lawn. You go out and you buy something at Home Depot and it's plant food. But the ecosystems have evolved over millions of years where the plants, through decay, create their plant food. So actually taking things out, you're removing a source of nourishment. And we haven't talked about the mycelium network, which is the fungi, which are also a critical part of this. that help in that decaying cycle that actually provides the very nutrients and enrichments in the soil. But, one of the things I've learned from the hidden life of trees, they are actually a network by which trees actually signal and communicate within the forest. And another funny anecdote, and we'll get to this because I want to drop this note, because we all had that last president, I won't mention his name, to talk about the forests are dirty, we should be going out there sweeping them up. So sweeping up forests is not a good idea, right?
No, it's not a good idea. Sweeping, raking, all the other terms that were used. Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, we hear politicians saying things like this. So we need to clean up the forest. We need to sanitize the forest. These are terrible ideas. From an ecological standpoint, from a biodiversity standpoint, from a climate change mitigation standpoint, they're terrible ideas because what they all mean is simplifying and essentially sterilizing the forest ecologically, damaging the soils, damaging the mycorrhizal fungi networks, removing nutrients, removing habitat, and also removing carbon and then sticking it in the atmosphere. Like we need more of that.
Well, the thing is that we're going to pick this right up because I had to close on that funny point, but it's really tongue in cheek, but it speaks to how politics undermines the serious action and work that we got to do. We'll be right back. We got to get this commercial in. Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, Aaron Muir, here with our guest, Dr. Chad Hanson of the John Muir Institute. And one of the critical things we're talking about is the power and the importance of forest and wilderness with regards to the climate crisis. So we start with the lead half of just breaking down a very complex but very ancient system. Right now, they're talking about how temperatures are the hottest in almost 125 million years. We as a species, humanity, has only been around for 200,000. But the forest ecosystems have been very much alive and active, creating the Goldilocks climate that we have enjoyed that has allowed our species to evolve and enjoy. And we have now been caught up in a fight of trying to save the planet, reducing the worst impacts of climate change that is actually coming from our inputs. Why they call this the anthropogenic or Anthropocene era, in which humanity as a species is driving climate disruption in an entirely new epoch. And we talked about at the close of the last point was how politicians cheekily talk about that we need to clean up the forest. And it goes right hand in hand with a model that saw forest as a resource that people could buy, sell, log, and they call it renewable because trees grow back. Chad, can you talk a little bit about the fallacy of renewable forests as it relates to climate change, and ecosystem, and the degradation and destruction of healthy ecosystems, impairing the ability of a forest to sequester carbon and save us from the worst effects of climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. Like when you're removing trees from a forest, not only are you damaging habitat, wildlife habitat, and biodiversity, but you're also removing trees that would otherwise be removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So trees essentially, in the simplest sense, they sort of breathe in CO2 and they breathe out oxygen. They use those carbon atoms to grow, and they draw down atmospheric CO2. So anytime you're removing trees from the forest, whether you call it, it doesn't matter what euphemism you use. You can call it thinning, you can call it, anything you want. And whether you're removing all the trees or some of the trees, you're going to undermine the carbon sink capacity of that forest. And so, this is something we need to get away from. We need to change our consumption patterns. We need to protect a lot more forest. It's an essential component of climate change mitigation at this point. We cannot solve the climate crisis only by getting away from fossil fuels. We have to protect a lot more forest.
Right now, the Adirondacks behind me, 6 million acres. To lay people, that's a lot of forest. You already have enough. And granted, it is the nation's largest deciduous forest. Granted, they call it America's lungs, but it's really like a small lobe. We need more than that. Should we not, since the president talked about something called 30 by 30, preserving 30% of America's wilderness areas by 2030, should we not be amplifying and as I say, saving and sequestering and protecting more forests, like going from the Algonquins, forest in Canada all the way down to the Adirondacks and preserving Maine? Should we basically begin a national policy, given the current disruption, to save as much of the deciduous forest in the Northeast as well as the Pacific Northwest?
Absolutely. We need to do this nationwide. We need far more resources and policies to increase protection for the forests of the Adirondacks. We need wildlife corridors. We need contiguous protected forests in the Northeast. We need it through allocation of funds for conservation easements. We need it through direct acquisition from willing sellers. We need to actually protect the public forests that are not fully protected. There's a lot of forests that are state forests, national forests that are being logged right now under outdated policies. And we need 21st century policies that understand that we actually need to put a premium on protection now for biodiversity and climate change mitigation, as well as access to nature for communities. And this needs to be a national policy. Right now we're spending tens of billions of dollars subsidizing the logging industry at the state and federal level. And that's making the climate crisis worse. And communities all across the country are feeling the impact of that.
Well, isn't cutting down trees and old growth forests and planting younger trees, isn't it a fact that younger trees are sequestering more carbon? Is that the truth, or is it not?
Yeah, this is one of the biggest lies that the logging industry and its allies, tell the public. So what they do is it's this really clever sleight of hand. It's actually not that clever, but they think it is. So if you think about a little seedling that they plant after a clear cut, that little seedling, it might double in its biomass, in 2 or 3 years. Of course, a large mature tree or an old growth tree, it doesn't double in its biomass in 2 or 3 years. And so what they'll do is they'll say, okay, well, proportionally, look, it's increasing. Its carbon sequestration is really high because of the rate of increase relative to its size. That's not the point. The point is, what is the absolute level of carbon sequestration of that tree? Now, obviously, a mature tree or an old growth tree is going to sequester and store vastly more carbon than a tiny little seedling planted after a clear cut, or 1,000 little seedlings for that matter. And so this is the big fallacy. The other big fallacy is that they don't take into account all the carbon emissions from the mature forest that they clear cut or logged in some other fashion before they planted trees. Because again, when you remove trees from the forest, most of that carbon goes into the atmosphere almost immediately. Very little ends up in a lumber product somewhere.
Is it not also the case that you can end up having old growth forest that's been around since the founding of this country and other things? It's taken it over 300 years, 400 years to get to that size. And true young trees, the scale of sequestration cannot be equated to forests that are 200, 300 years old and larger, correct?
That's exactly right. And this is why climate scientists are increasingly turning to a concept that we call proforestation. And that simply means protecting existing forests from logging so that they can maximize carbon sequestration and climate change mitigation. That's where you get your biggest bang for the buck by far. It's not about planting trees. And frankly, most of the time planting trees it's happening in the context of logging. And so really, we need to prioritize protecting existing forests. That's really what we need to focus on. I mean, obviously, protecting existing public lands and getting them out of the commercial logging business, that's key. Getting our national forests and our U.S. Forest Service out of the commercial logging business. But we can't stop there. We need to protect a lot of lands that are currently in private ownership or in state ownership, and it's going to take some money to do that. And so,
well,
that
gets us right to the Inflation Reduction Act. We got over $3 trillion now, and one of the biggest entities is U.S. Department of Agriculture, which oversees the Forest Service. Should we not be doing a crop subsidy program for not cutting forests and giving the same benefit to small acre holders, like 10 acres, like the Dogwood Alliance down in the South, going from Washington, D.C. all the way over to Louisiana? So providing incentives for folks to, get a tax credit to preserve their forests. Should we not be coming up with innovative programs right now to help? Because we need small holders. And so should we not be protecting more forests and getting those easements?
Absolutely. Conservation easements, acquisition where landowners want to sell, but a lot of this can be done through conservation easements and stay in private ownership. But basically, pay the landowners, small landowners as well as larger, pay them not to log. I mean, that's where the money should be going. Right now, we're spending tens of billions of dollars subsidizing the logging industry to do the wrong thing. Instead, we should be paying landowners to actually help mitigate the climate crisis.
Well, one of the things that kills me is that they mock that suggestion by saying, "What do you mean paying people not to cut the trees?" I go, "Well, we already pay farmers not to grow crops." Joni Ernst, from Iowa, her family receives millions of dollars in what they call crop subsidies, or basically not growing stuff. But the fact of the matter, the model is already proven. The financial tax code already exists for farmers and crops. Yep. Trees are not crops unless they're held by forest product entities. Can we not say that a crop is a crop, whether it's held by the forest product sector or is held by Joe Q citizens, and that they could get an incentive the same way we incentivize private sector and farmers? So the answer is being liberal with the incentive, but we've got the money, the largest set aside of money with trillions of dollars for the first time in human history in the United States to act on climate. But why are we not making that investment?
Yeah, and that's the key question, because you're absolutely right. We should be making that investment, and we should also be applying that investment and offering that investment in terms of tax incentives and direct payments and conservation easements to small landowners. 3 acres, 5 acres, 10 acres, not just the big landowners. And this because it's a critically important public good, right? Keeping those forests standing and keeping the carbon in those forests and allowing them to draw down that dangerous excess CO2 in our atmosphere. That's a critical public good that benefits everybody, and the landowners should reap that benefit. Right now, we're not doing that for reasons that have nothing to do with science, nothing to do with ecology, nothing to do with public good, but instead because it's not to the financial interest of most of the large logging companies that want to log intensively on their private lands and maximize short-term profits, despite the harm that it does to the climate and communities and to biodiversity. When instead, we should be changing our policies and shifting the way we do things. And so politics are basically driving
what
this.
What we're going to do is take a break right here, and we will pick it up in the next segment. Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Our guest, the incredible Dr. Chad Hanson, and we are right now talking about climate impacts, climate solutions, but more importantly, the power of trees in our forests. And one of the things when I talk about the Adirondacks, places like it, the Pacific Northwest being the lungs of America, people when they go out and they see these massive green tracts, they think that there's enough. And the answer is the climate crisis is proving that there's not enough. There's no planet B. This is one single planet. It's a closed ecosystem. One of the things they talk about when dealing with the politics of global warming, they say, well, the Earth, as it goes through space, it's actually releasing heat into space. And that is true, but the fact of the matter is Earth is warming up because of greenhouse gases, and it's trapping more heat within the atmosphere than it is offing or releasing into the deepness of space. And one of the things we find is the more greenhouse gases we pump into the atmosphere, the warmer the Earth is getting. 2 of the greenhouse gases, methane, carbon, basically all derived mostly from fossil fuels or biomass. But we don't talk about a third greenhouse gas, and it's because the Earth is 75% water. The third greenhouse gas happens to be water vapor. What does it mean with a hotter planet and the more release of more water vapor and what they call the catastrophic feedback loop? Can you talk a little bit about that, Dr. Hanson?
Yeah. So a lot of people have this notion that as the planet warms because of anthropogenic climate change, that it's really about a hotter and drier future. And of course, that can happen as well in lots of places. Drought cycles can be exacerbated in places. So, a lot of it's, sort of climate chaos that's happening. But what people forget also is that it's also warmer and wetter in a lot of places. And there are tons of feedback loops that come into play when temperatures rise, and you can increase evaporation, and we're affecting all kinds of climate cycles and patterns that are affecting precipitation. One of the consequences of that is extreme precipitation events that can happen. And we've seen some of that recently, unfortunately, with some tragic consequences in places. So it's not a simplistic thing where it's just hotter and drier. It can also be warmer and wetter, and sometimes that wetter can be fairly catastrophic.
And that's the steam bath and the steam effect. So not only you can absolutely, as we saw in the Midwest and the South, is that not only did you have the heat, but you had the moisture, and that steam bath effect, where when you sweat, the atmosphere can't even draw off the sweat, so you literally broil, and so that's a crisis. But the other piece, we talk about the polar vortex and how it gets destabilized. And the polar vortex are these, trade winds that are going around the top of the North Pole and the South Pole. They're constantly going around. And with the changes in planet, the differential around the planet, and because of moisture and forests, etc., it causes this thing to dip and wag. And it carries this polar vortex, or this vortex, or we call it the jet stream, is the conveyor belt by which weather systems and weather fronts are basically pulled around the globe. Can you talk about, some of the events that you've witnessed this past winter in the Pacific Northwest? Right now, just recently this weekend, from West Point, New York City, Adirondacks, communities literally had road washouts. There are places in towns that right now are totally cut off because of the atmospheric rivers pouring and flooding the entire Northeast. Again, like I said, from the Adirondacks all the way down to New York City. I lost my car last week because I actually hit a massive flooded section of Route 87 in the Northeast. And I, along with several other cars, went off the road. So talk a little bit more about these effects and what does it mean? And again, these are all costs that the country has to bear: insurance costs, insurance loss costs. Talk about the effects, the distributed effects, and the impacts, above and beyond just global warming.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I'm aware of that extreme rain event in recent days in the Northeast, and I'm really glad you walked away from that accident safely, despite the damage to your car. We're this last winter in the Sierra Nevada, for example, we had the biggest winter in perhaps a century. Certainly in the southern Sierra Nevada, it was probably the biggest winter in over a century. And
give us numbers. How many inches? How many feet?
Oh my God. It depends on the location. Like, where we are, we live on the dry side of the Sierra Nevada mountains at about 7,000 feet in elevation. We're in pinyon juniper forest, so we're in a drier side. But, we still got about 20 feet probably cumulatively of snow here, which is a lot more than we typically get here. But a lot of the areas where they are in the different forest types that get more snow naturally, they got levels of snow that most people think is a typographical error when they saw it in the news stories. They thought it was a mistake or an internet hoax or something. It's for real. So just for example, on Mammoth Mountain, in the kind of central southern Sierra Nevada on the east side, they got over 700 inches of snow. Wow. And that was at the base of the mountain. Top of the mountain, it was even more than that. So God. There was literally and that's the cumulative total over the course of the winter. But you're talking about areas that at any one point in time had 25, 30 feet of standing snow depth. You had whole communities in certain parts of the Sierra Nevada and some of the higher elevation communities where people were digging tunnels to access a second-story window.
Wow.
Tunnels down through the snow, 8, 10 feet to access the second-story window. Buildings were collapsing. I mean, there are places that I know, including in the Southern California mountains. They got one snowstorm dumped 8 feet of snow just in one snowstorm. 2 different supermarkets that I know that had been there for generations. They just couldn't handle the load. The buildings collapsed. So we're seeing the types of disruption. And by the way, that wasn't last winter was not predicted initially to be a big winter. It was predicted to be a below average winter. So the other part of climate chaos, in my view, is that it's making it more difficult to predict the really extreme weather events. And it seems like, you guys experienced some of that too in the Northeast with this extreme rain event where, that type of, extreme rain event was not, people didn't see that coming a week in advance, so this is something we really need to pay attention to unless we get a hold of our fossil fuel consumption and our logging practices, and unless we change our patterns and really take the climate crisis seriously, as those CO2 levels keep climbing in our atmosphere, that levels of disruption are going to accelerate, and we just can't afford that.
And it's really critical because the politicians, in taking your Sierra Nevada point, they go, well, that's evidence that the earth is cooling. Look at all the snow. And why is that an asinine argument?
Right. Yeah, because it's climate change. It's not just global warming. And like, a lot of my colleagues call it, climate chaos. As the CO2 levels climb, yeah, warming happens, but also what happens is more extreme weather of all types. Drought cycles can get more extreme. Extreme rain events can get more extreme. Extreme winters can get more extreme. Here's just one example. So there are natural climate cycles that have been going on for a very, very long time, that long predate the Industrial Revolution, that predate all of humanity. They've been going on for a long time. But with climate change driven by human activities, a lot of those cycles are being thrown out of whack. Some of them are being exacerbated, and they're becoming more frequent. So one of those that is predicted to potentially become more frequent is this roughly 150-year cycle that's gone on for thousands of years in the Pacific states, especially California, where roughly once every 150 years, there's a really, really extreme winter, far beyond what most winters are. And last time it happened at that level was the winter of 1861 to 1862. The governor was inaugurated by rowboat because they had to actually evacuate the state capital. And so one of the predictions, they call that a megastorm phenomenon. One of the predictions is that those megastorms could become more frequent and even more intense. And, so again, another consequence of climate chaos as we keep pumping CO2 into the atmosphere from fossil fuel consumption, but also from logging, which is, one of the great unaccounted for sources of greenhouse gas emissions, because policymakers have created a fiction where they say, well, we're going to treat emissions from logging as zero because we'll just theoretically assume trees grow back. Oftentimes they don't after logging, or they grow back in a stunted way. And policymakers are not taking into account all the carbon emissions from the trees that are removed. And then a lot of those trees are burned for energy production, wood pellets and biomass plants. And it's really the dirtiest form of energy. It's even worse than coal from a climate standpoint, for equal energy produced.
And one of the things that they don't factor in is that, the planet is not in a static position. We actually evolve around the suns, and we have the vernal equinox. As we start to get further away from the sun, the earth starts to tilt, and these all come together to, impact the weather events and impact the disparate levels of heating and freezing and cooling. Listen, we got to get this commercial in here. We will be right back for the last segment. Sunday morning, our last segment, news, views, and interviews, and we're having a very important, informative conversation around climate and climate change. And again, one of the things that Chad was pointing out was that climate disruption is that as the Earth goes through, in the case of the Northeast, we're in our summer right now, but in the winter, as the Earth starts to move further away as it goes around the sun, it starts to tilt and alter. But those prevailing systems, the what we call the vortexes, or what we call the jet stream, the northern jet stream or the southern jet stream, they're the conveyor belts that are carrying weather around the planet. And as the Earth in the South during the winter, they start to warm up. And that's why you notice the fires in Latin America. The stuff that we're hitting right now in North America during our summer, we have the summer for the South. And in their summer, they are hitting the same events. The Australia continent, getting 45 degrees Celsius, basically 120, 125 degrees. These are real serious threats. Now, we don't see them because we're clothing in more wetter weather and more colder weather, but because of the greenhouse gas of water in the air, along with methane, along with carbon, there's more moisture. As Chad pointed out, there's more snow and more rain events. In fact, places like Texas last year, many people don't realize the freezing rains, the flooding that occurred in the dead of winter, that flash froze. And for the first time, that state, about over 70% of the state was under feet of ice. So much so that a guy that told me to apologize that the climate change is a hoax, Ted Cruz, took a trip to Cancun, and he told me to apologize because he says that we're alarming the globe. We're scaring the people, and that the planet is actually in a cooling cycle called climate pause. Can you tell us why climate pause is really the hoax? The climate is not pausing, and we're witnessing more and more extreme events from year to year.
Yeah. The planet is not cooling. So if any politicians saying that are just absolutely misleading the public and their constituents. The planet is getting warmer, and it is being driven by human activities, fossil fuel consumption and logging, both of which are pumping huge amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere, and we can't afford that. But again, I think the point here is that it's not just warming temperatures; it's also the climate disruption that is caused by rising CO2 levels caused by human activities. And as CO2 levels climb higher, that disruption can take the form of lots of different things in more extreme fashions. Droughts can get worse and more protracted in places, and other places you can have much more extreme weather in terms of rain events and snow events. And they can flip-flop back and forth in more extreme fashions in a given location too. So the extremes get more extreme is the point as we disrupt the climate more and more with the excess CO2 in the atmosphere. And we have to curb that. We just have to get away from that. We have to bring those CO2 levels down to less than 350 parts per million. And the only way to do that is get away from fossil fuels and protect a lot more ecosystems, especially forest.
Well, scientists were telling us about 6 years ago, we have about 10 years to really seriously act on it, or we're going to be locked in for the worst effects, what they call the first wave effects of climate disruption. We ended up electing a president that felt that the way you solve the science was fire all the climate scientists, and the less reporting on climate, just like COVID, the less reporting on the science, it'll go away. As if we can stick our heads in the sand, or it's like a political debate, or you tell somebody to shut up, it will stop. We are now 6 years post that point. And we just only last year passed the Inflation Reduction Act with a lot of headwinds and resistance. And at best, it's going to be the first year that we start putting shovels in the ground. So we're going to be 8 years out of that 10-year warning window. What does it mean for the planet to have that first 1.5 jump, and then that 2 degrees Celsius? Because once we get to 3 degrees Celsius, some scientists are saying we're done for as a species. But we are really close right now that we need to urgently act now. So what does it mean with that jump, and what must we do?
Right. I mean, the jump is exponentially more problematic the higher it goes. It's not a linear increase in terms of the disruption. It's an exponential increase. So we really have to get a handle on this. The crisis is now. The time to act is now. The Inflation Reduction Act has hundreds of millions of dollars, billions and billions of dollars for clean energy. And that's really, really important. We have to shift away from fossil fuels. In my view, that means we need to prioritize community and rooftop solar and really, really scale that up and devote the resources necessary to do that. So I think that we're on the right path there in many ways. Where I think the Inflation Reduction Act fails is the other side of the coin, which is the natural climate solutions aspect, which is equally important at this point in terms of mitigating and overcoming the climate crisis. And in fact, the Inflation Reduction Act has $2 billion of additional subsidies for logging in one provision, and other provisions that could be even more problematic in terms of billions of dollars going for tax breaks for logging companies and activities. So that's what we need to change. We need to understand that we need to do two things equally and at the same time. We need to embrace clean energy and move away from fossil fuels, but we also need to embrace natural climate solutions and protect a whole lot more forest and turn those logging subsidies instead into subsidies to help landowners, including small woodlot owners, keep their forest standing and pay them to do that. As well as, subsidies for tree-free and non-wood alternatives. We need to shift our consumption patterns.
I think that this is a critical part of the conversation from the point of solutions of what we must do. The forests that stand behind me, the Adirondacks, needs to have the Adirondacks Algonquin corridor made. The Algonquin Adirondacks to Maine woods, that needs to be manifest. To me, that is as critical as when we built the interstate highway system. And now we need that global and international interstate forest system of ecological protection. Do you think we're at the stage, and hopefully, awareness that Americans would start to develop action in this space? I mean, we talk about a Green New Deal. We need the workforce development. We have an opportunity to retool our workforce in these spaces of ecological systems maintenance and health. We have a chance to really invest in America while at the same time saving the planet. Do you think we will be able to seize the moment?
I do. I'm fundamentally an optimist. I do think we're going to be able to seize the moment. I do think we're going to turn the corner on this. We are going to need leadership. Bold, courageous leadership from some people of good conscience in Congress, and I think that's what we need most right now. We also need a lot of different organizations to band together and organize and put that pressure on members of Congress so they'll do the right thing. But I do believe we're going to turn the corner on it because frankly we have to. We don't have a choice.
Right, because clearly, climate does not care about your boundaries, your borders, your politics. It doesn't care about your race, your gender, or orientation. It doesn't care about your notion of supremacy. The climate is the great equalizer. We're seeing when these storm events come in, they are coming in and they're hitting America and the globe hard. One of my dear friends, John Davis, a dear friend of both of us, John Davis, who's been working an advocate of wildlife corridors. And, his whole point is not only do we have to plan these large scale ecosystems, but also all the healthy subsystems, within them, and that we have to restore them. And we have to basically pull humanity to place what we call livable zones. And these are going to be all part of the effort going forward. How do we start to live within a footprint that we should be living within, Chad?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that we've been rewarding dangerous excess through subsidies, and I'm not categorically opposed to subsidies. I think there's a lot of things we can do with subsidies, but let's make the world better with subsidies instead of making it worse every day. With subsidies for the fossil fuel industry, subsidies for the logging industry coming out of taxpayers'
Elon
pockets.
Musk got $1 billion to build solar panels in Buffalo. Elon's not pouring money in. He's basically going in for he's selling more cars because we're giving
Right.
tens of thousands, $20,000 almost per unit of a Tesla sold. So some people are not complaining about subsidies.
No, absolutely right. Well, and I think there's a critical realization here that needs to occur, and I think this will occur. But I think that we can all do our part to help people understand, policymakers, news outlets, general public. People get the fact that when we're burning fossil fuels, anywhere in the world, we're affecting every other place in the world. This is a global problem. They get that, so I think they understand. But when it comes to forests, I think a lot of people are still sort of stuck in an outdated mode of thinking that, oh, well, that's an issue out there somewhere that doesn't really affect me. And the thing is, I think that's what we need to come to a realization that when these logging operations happen, if an old growth forest on a national forest in Oregon is logged with taxpayer money, that affects communities in New York and in Chicago and in Miami and in Bangladesh and all over the world. So this is a deeply interconnected national and global issue, and we are all in it together.
Thank you. I want to drop your URL, the John Muir URL, and the link down below. Dr. Chad Hanson, I want to thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to really connect with our listeners at this particular moment in time, given the crisis that the entire country is facing and dealing with day to day. It's just been our stage this week, this past month, with the storms that have hit the entire Northeast and really crippled New York State, especially upstate New York. Again, thank you for your time, brother, and we will definitely have you back in advance of COP28.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, and I'd be happy to come back anytime.